She was a promising young research scientist who thought she found her perfect match.
She was very well liked in the community and at work. He was like the office stud.
Their relationship was progressing. Maybe this is meant to be.
But this office romance wouldn't have a fairy tale ending.
There's bloody handprints on the walls. There's blood smeared on the floor.
The violence was so over the top that it had to have some personal connection.
The ensuing investigation would reveal that Mr. Wright wasn't as perfect as he appeared to be, and someone had decided to make him pay for it.
And I was like, is there a female serial killer? What's going on here?
The person who committed this murder had a score to settle. They chose violence. Bloody violence.
Friday, November 8th, 2002. It's a quiet afternoon in the picturesque harbor area of Stamford, Connecticut. Until 12:13 p.m., when local police receive a disturbing 911 call.
Stamford, please. Hello?
Yes, hello. A guy is attacked my neighbor. I saw a guy go into her apartment.
The 911 dispatch asks her, what is your neighbor's name? She doesn't know her name, but what she does know is the number of the door.
I don't know her name, but the guy was there and attacked her. I heard yelling.
Okay. You don't know your... Hello? Hello?
The call cuts off abruptly at that point. They don't know if she hung up, got disconnected, or if she could be in danger as well.
Officers are immediately dispatched to the apartment identified by the caller.
This is a upper-level condominium on the waterfront. They have docks there. It's a very nice neighborhood. So you're not prepared for what you're going to see when you open that door.
They enter the apartment and find the body of a dead woman inside.
The victim was lying just inside the threshold of the door, and there was a tremendous amount of blood. We felt that definitely a stabbing was involved. We could look at the victim, and even without additional information from the medical examiner, you could see a number of stab wounds about the chest and neck area.
The officers quickly secure the area and call for backup.
Considering the location, they knew this was going to be a high-profile case.
When I first got down there, there was a lot of police, and the area was taped off, and it was hard to get information. Police weren't giving anything, but I do remember a source of mine slipping me a note.
By the next morning, the victim's face is all over the news. She is a beautiful 32-year-old research scientist named Annalisa Raimundo.
Annalisa Raimundo was born to Filipino parents who immigrated into this country. Wonderful people. Her father was a doctor. Mother was a professional.
She was just a go-getter, came from a family with very high standards. And I think not only did they want the best for her, but she fought to have the best for herself. Attended Harvard, attended Columbia for graduate school, and just kind of the apple of her parents' eye.
After finishing her degrees, Annalisa could have pursued a career anywhere in the country, but she decided to stay in Connecticut.
She had her pick, and she chose to go into pharmaceutical research, and she was one of the best at her job.
She worked at Purdue Pharma, this big company, right downtown Stamford.
She wanted to help people and make the world a better place, but pharmaceuticals are also big business. By her late 20s, she had made enough money to buy herself a condo in Chapin.
She was just climbing the ranks and making a wonderful life for herself.
Annalisa's devotion to her job left little time for relationships, so it wasn't surprising that she fell in love with a coworker.
So while working at Purdue Pharma, she met a man by the name of Nelson Sessler, who worked there as well.
He was tall, handsome, and he was like the office stud, and everybody had a crush on him.
They started out as friends and then began dating casually at first.
But by the summer of 2002, the romance between Annalisa and Nelson had become more serious.
Their relationship was progressing. He was spending the night quite a bit at her condo.
Employees definitely knew them as a couple. When there was a work function, they were together. They went out together. They did dinners together.
They're making good money, and everything appeared that it was a good relationship.
For Annalisa, I mean, she really felt like this was going to be her husband, like they were going to get married.
But the couple's plans for the future would never be realized. 32-year-old Annalisa has been found murdered in her waterfront condominium, and the entire community wants to know why. Leading the investigation into this high-pressure case is Captain Richard Conklin.
The minute you enter that apartment, the crime scene is all there. Different items that had been knocked about. One of the more bloody scenes I had ever seen.
One of the first things they want to do is find the 911 caller. She had hung up so abruptly, they had to be thinking the worst, that maybe she was a victim as well.
Someone called 911, and that person who called 911 said they were a neighbor. Who is it? Well, what happens is, when they begin to send out other investigators and start looking at tracing the call, what they find is kind of strange.
We find that the call came from a payphone about a half mile from this crime scene.
If this caller's life is in danger, it would make sense for her to get away and call from someplace safe. But if she had done so, why didn't she just say that?
They alleged that they were a witness to this disturbance. And, these are the things that were racing through our mind. Why didn't this person identify themselves?
I think there were some red flags that immediately went up at that point.
Immediately, we had to come up to speed very quickly. Who was this victim? What were we dealing with? Who might have done this to her?
Coming up, crime scene investigation reveals clues about the killer.
Stabbing someone is a crime of passion. You have to have some real deep feelings to kill someone that maliciously.
Under intense media scrutiny, Connecticut police have begun an investigation into the murder of 32-year-old research scientist Annalisa Raimundo.
We're knocking on doors, we're doing computerized checks as to that residence. Has there been different disturbance calls there? Have they called for police services prior? All these are going on at one time and very, very rapidly.
Mind you, this is still early in the afternoon on a workday, so many of her neighbors weren't home. The few that were home reported hearing nothing.
The 911 call has been traced to a nearby payphone, but the caller's identity is still unknown.
We send people to process this area. At that time, they didn't have security cameras trained on that outside payphone. It's difficult to get straight up fingerprints off of it because there's so many people handling these payphones back at that point.
Police canvass the other businesses in the area, hoping someone saw the caller, but they come up empty-handed. Meanwhile, a team of forensic specialists is busy processing the condominium for evidence.
I can't really describe how frantic you are in the beginning of a high-level homicide like this and the number of tasks you're undertaking at one time. Soon after seeing this scene, I made a decision, and it's one I've only made a couple times in my entire career. We decided to call in the state police major crime unit. DNA was just starting to be a wonderful tool for law enforcement. And when we saw what a bloody crime scene this was, we really wanted to preserve the scene. And you only get one chance, one shot at processing a crime scene. If you don't do it well, you lose the evidence.
What they would have seen standing from the foyer, basically, is a female victim who appears to be 25 to 35. Long black hair, kind of lying on the ground. There's bloody handprints on the walls, and there's blood smeared on the floor.
There was no forced entry. The lock was in good shape. It hadn't been tampered with. So you have to think that perhaps someone knocked or rang the doorbell and our victim answered the door and then either allowed someone entry or someone kind of pushed their way through at that point. And then it looked like immediately a life and death struggle took place.
Annalisa's injuries provide a terrifying summary of the attack.
There was a very violent struggle. There was glass broken. Annalisa was smashed over the head with an object and also stabbed several times in the face and neck, chest.
Stabbing someone is a crime of passion. You have to be angry with someone or have some real deep feelings to kill someone that maliciously. And she was stabbed 9 times.
The dumbbell on the ground has hair and it has blood on it. So they know that dumbbell was used in this crime in some way.
Annalisa's skull had been fractured by a heavy blow, and she had been stabbed a total of 9 times to the face, neck, and chest. One of the stab wounds had even reached the back of her lung. Thankfully, there was no sign of sexual assault.
No, this was a prolonged attack, but whatever edged knife or weapon was used was not left at the scene. We could not locate that in that area.
Further inspection also reveals a trail of blood leading away from the body.
You can see bloody footprints and smudges going all the way to the bathroom. So for investigators, that bathroom becomes a focal point.
There was some blood, a droplet of blood, as they described it, on the sink handle in the bathroom there near the entryway.
We kind of felt that someone might have washed up there because it would be odd, to find that blood on that fixture like that.
Police are hopeful the DNA will help identify Annalisa's killer. But what prompted the attack?
You make some assessments as you're going along. Could someone had attempted to burglarize this location and didn't realize that she was home? As we look through the apartment, there's so many valuables left around. The place isn't ransacked.
There's silverware, there's computers, there's TVs. There's still money in her pocketbook.
I felt that the violence was so over the top that it almost had to have some personal connection to it.
And police quickly learn there is no one closer to Annalisa than her boyfriend, Nelson.
We started contacting friends and family. We were talking to neighbors, and we were able to make that she was in a relationship with Nelson Sessler. So immediately, that's put on our to-do list.
Coming up, a loving boyfriend or a cold-blooded killer?
I've seen people on scenes drop to their knees screaming and crying in disbelief that someone is dead. Why is this guy not completely distraught?
Hours after finding Annalisa Raimundo murdered in her luxury condominium, investigators have a potential suspect, her boyfriend, Nelson Sessler.
You're looking at domestic partners, especially such a violent crime like this, and you realize that you want to make contact immediately because such a violent, bloody crime scene, there's no way that there wasn't transfer of blood to the attacker.
But before officers can even begin searching for him, Nelson unexpectedly shows up at the crime scene.
Up pulls this guy. And he wants to know what's going on in that condominium. Why do you want to know? That's my girlfriend/fiance in there.
There was, no bloody clothing, no scratch marks on his face.
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They know the killer used the bathroom sink to wash the blood off, so now they're really interested to see what Nelson has to say.
He said they were already engaged or they were about to get engaged, but they were definitely becoming more serious and they were talking about marriage, and they had a very good relationship.
They tell him, that his fiancée has been the victim of a homicide, and they were struck by his reaction. It wasn't a typical grief or grieving type of action. It was very emotionless.
If I'm told my fiancée was just murdered, I'm going to lose it. Nelson doesn't shed a tear. He kind of bows his head a little bit and sits there, and he's kind of like, oh, geez, golly, I can't believe this happened.
Despite his strange reaction, Nelson denies having anything to do with Annalisa's death.
According to Nelson, the last time he saw her was the morning he was leaving for work. He said they'd made plans to get together again that night.
She moved to another company in New Jersey. She was working from home a lot, traveling back and forth to New Jersey.
He and Annalisa were supposed to go into the city to have drinks with a friend from Purdue Pharma.
While police try to verify Nelson's story, his attitude does little to reduce their suspicions.
They want to keep this guy contained, so they keep him in this lounge. And as they're going through the crime scene, they come back to him. He's sleeping.
This guy was so laid back. Yeah, my girlfriend was just killed, but I'm going to go take a nap.
They ask him for a DNA sample, which he voluntarily gives up, but the way he's acting is sending all kinds of red flags.
But when investigators contact the pharmaceutical company, they confirm his alibi.
The good thing about Purdue Pharma is they have a very extensive security system with cameras and a badge type of check-in.
They were able to look at that time frame when this murder happened and see that Nelson was indeed at work, as he said.
He had a very rock-solid alibi at that point that he was not the killer.
With Nelson no longer a suspect, detectives turn their attention back to the missing female 911 caller.
They ask Nelson if there are any women that he could think of that would want to hurt Annalisa. No one immediately comes to mind, but he does give police the name of 2 former girlfriends who both suffered from depression.
Investigators quickly rule out both women, as well as the rest of Annalisa's family.
They weren't anywhere near the condo at the time of the murder, and they didn't have a motive, but police did take a DNA sample just in case.
We're doing meticulous work, but we really don't have anything that we're really locked into.
You start to look at, well, what's going on in this area of the condominium? Well, one thing they find out is a lot of the yachts parked near there are burgled. And they start looking at some of the people arrested for those crimes.
Anyone that was arrested in the city of Stamford was being debriefed. Do they know anything about this? There was a great deal of frustration that we weren't making great headway in this investigation.
Detectives' best hope for a lead comes from the DNA tests performed on the blood found in Annalisa's bathroom.
The DNA hit comes back on a mixture of both our victim and another person's DNA. And again, you start looking for elimination, like you look for elimination fingerprints.
They compared that sample to the exemplars they had with everyone they had talked to so far. As suspected, it didn't match Nelson or the victim's family.
They submit that blood into CODIS, into all the systems, but comes up negative. If that person hadn't been arrested before, it's not going to pop up.
It would either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to any suspects that we developed later in this investigation. So it was certainly something we were very happy about and hopeful.
But when months go by without any new developments in the case, those hopes begin to wane.
There is no one left to interview at this point, and they still need more information on this mysterious 911 caller. It's like the investigation just comes to a halt at this point.
You're just waiting for something to come in. It eats you up inside because you want answers for the family. You want justice.
Coming up, News of another stabbing provides investigators with the break they've been looking for.
And I was like, is there a female serial killer? What, what's going on here?
After 5 months of investigation into the murder of Annalisa Raimundo, Connecticut police seem to have reached a dead end. But on March 23, 2003, an incident in nearby New York changes that.
I remember I came in the office and my editor was saying, you need to look into this. There was a stabbing in Westchester County and someone called and said they think it's related to Annalisa's death.
Westchester Medical Center. Sunday night, some hospital employees were out on their break and they hear a scuffle in the car park.
It's dark and they can't be sure what they're seeing, but it appears to be a man and a woman who are engaged in a physical altercation.
A security guard intervened, separated the two, and they called the police.
The man was bleeding heavily from 3 stab wounds to the chest. Luckily, they were right outside of an emergency room, and he was able to be treated immediately.
They got the suspect, who was the wife, in, and the Westchester authorities started questioning her. They felt that they had an attempt at murder here.
The victim's name is Paul Christos. His wife is 33-year-old Sheila Davalu. Sheila tells investigators that she and Paul had met as fellow students at New York Medical College in 1994, before getting married in May of 2000.
They were rising up the ranks of their careers in college, getting master's degrees, doctorates, and they were good together.
Sheila claims they have it all wrong. She was trying to help her husband, not hurt him.
What time was it when he came home?
I didn't notice him at first. I was playing with the dog, and then he came and he said he's hurt, and he laid on the floor, and he's like, "Can you look at it, see if it's bleeding?" I saw the wounds in his chest.
Was there blood around his body?
There's definitely a lot of blood.
Sheila claims they decided it would take too long for an ambulance to arrive, so she drove Paul to the hospital.
If she and Paul weren't fighting in the parking lot, then what were they doing when the security guard had to separate them? And why did she take the time to park the car at all?
Sheila, I have to be honest with you. I find it odd.
The whole thing is odd.
Meanwhile, doctors have stabilized Paul's condition. The first thing he does is ask to speak to police.
Paul Christos is a strong guy. I mean, here's a guy who was stabbed 3 times, punctured lung, bled profusely, but he's talking. He wants to tell his story.
Their marriage had not apparently been doing well for a while. They were both academics, but they were kind of living separate lives. He was continuing on with school. She had this career.
Paul says that when he came home earlier that day, Sheila suggested they try something new to reignite their relationship.
He was still trying to work on this marriage, so when he's, hearing, okay, we're going to play a sex game, he's, all in for it.
He describes some game he was playing with his wife, whereby they would blindfold each other and they would rub different objects on each other, and the blindfolded person had to guess what the object was. He describes how he was blindfolded, tied to a chair, and his wife is rubbing objects on him, and all of a sudden he just feels this kind of thrust, this sharp pain in his chest. And he tells her, "Please take the blindfold off. What's going on here?" And he looks down and he sees blood. His wife says, "Oh, it was a candle, and there must have been some piece of metal sticking out of the bottom of the candle, and it cut you or something." He buys that, I guess.
Paul's still in love with Sheila, and I think the fact that he's willing to still believe her despite how badly he's injured is a testament to that.
He's like, "Okay, but I'm kind of losing blood and I'm getting dizzy. Call 911. He's in the chair listening to his wife as she describes, "My husband is hurt, he's bleeding, and we need an ambulance here." They wait.
Paul says they waited for what seemed like a very long time, but the ambulance never showed up.
He begs his wife, put me in the car, take me to the ER. He's in the back seat. She pulls into the hospital parking lot and pulls around back. He's like, what's going on? She gets out of the car, comes over, opens the passenger door in the back. She has a knife in her hand. She begins to attack him.
She stabs him again, and thank goodness this hospital employees were out there and heard what was going on.
Now he knows something. He knows it wasn't a candle. His wife blindfolded him, strapped him to a chair, and then stabbed him.
Investigators confront Sheila with her husband's testimony, but she denies trying to kill him.
She admits to using a knife in their sex game, but she insists that she never meant to hurt Paul.
How could you put a knife into somebody's chest by accident? I don't know. Paul said he was safe again. On the way to the hospital.
But when detectives search the hospital parking lot, they find two damning pieces of evidence.
They find a bloody kitchen knife and Sheila's cell phone, which she dropped during the struggle. When they search her call history, it's easy to see she's been lying to them.
Sheila Davalu never called 911 for an ambulance. She never dialed the number.
Instead, she called someone else in Stamford, and there were voicemails from that same number in return.
It's a guy who is traveling down to Westchester County in order to meet Sheila that night for dinner and spend the weekend. So it's clear that she has a lover, and that man's name is Nelson Sessler.
Coming up, detectives in New York and Connecticut join forces to solve the murder of Annalisa Raimundo.
I think that he needed a shoulder to cry on, and so she kind of played into that. He was vulnerable.
New York police suspect 33-year-old Sheila Davalu tried to kill her husband and make it look like an accident. But they're about to discover she's also connected to a different stabbing.
She's been arrested and charged in New York at this point, and they know she's been having an affair with a man named Nelson, and they want to find out if he's involved as well.
So an investigator makes the 45-minute drive from Westchester to Stamford.
She heads up to Stamford, Connecticut, knocks on the door to his apartment. No answer. Knocks again. No answer.
A neighbor hears the commotion and comes outside, and they just want to know if they found who murdered Nelson's fiancée yet.
Well, what are you talking about, murder? And so she pieces together right there that there's a murder in Stamford, and now she has a man stabbed in Westchester County, and that somehow these could be connected.
She immediately contacts the detectives investigating Annalisa's murder. Hours later, Nelson Sessler is brought in for more questioning.
Whether he was complicit or not is something we needed to find out. You know, the oddity of this attack, the oddity and the timing of this phone call.
Nelson says all three of them worked at Purdue Pharma together. He briefly dated Sheila before he met Annalisa, but it was pretty casual, and that's why he hadn't mentioned her before.
Sheila and Nelson had started seeing each other in 2001, but the relationship wasn't exclusive.
Nelson, is kind of casually dating Sheila Davalu at this point and starts to casually date Annalisa Raimundo.
Until he got serious with Annalisa, and then that relationship ceased.
Nelson claims he and Sheila had broken things off in 2002. He also admits that for the past 2 months, he had been seeing Sheila again, but claims the affair hadn't begun until 2 months after Annalisa was killed.
He was trying to get over the death of Annalisa, and I think that he needed a shoulder to cry on, and so she kind of played into that.
Nelson said that Sheila had reached out to him with a care package full of cookies and things like that. Then the next weekend, she invited him on a ski trip with some friends from work, but when he got there, it was just the two of them.
Either he's really gullible or she's really smart. Maybe a little bit of both, but he, fell right into her trap and kind of rekindled their relationship.
Nelson also claims he had no idea Sheila was married.
She worked at Purdue Pharma in Stamford, Connecticut. The one thing Sheila didn't mention at Purdue Pharma was that she had a husband in Westchester County. She never told anyone about that.
Nelson told police he had slept over her house several times, but he never saw any signs of anyone else living there.
When investigators follow up with Sheila's husband, they find out why.
He goes into a lengthy story about her having supposedly a disabled brother who would come and visit for the weekend.
Sheila says, if my brother finds out I'm married to you, he's going to get really upset. He's very possessive that way. Paul felt sorry for her and for him.
It's hard to believe, but he would clean out anything that would link him to the apartment. Any pictures, clothes. He would go and stay with friends or in a hotel.
Sheila would then have Nelson Sessler come over and sleep with him all weekend while Paul was at a hotel.
In retrospect, it's easy for Paul to see his wife's deception, but he says it didn't stop there.
Sheila, she had this whole story that she would tell Paul all the time, about her friends at work, Melissa and Jack and Lisa, and how it was a love triangle. She'd go home at night at the end of the day and say to Paul, I feel so bad for my friend Melissa. How can I help her? She's really put out. She's really heartbroken because Jack is interested in this other woman. What do I do?
Paul at one point had an interest in becoming an FBI agent. He had had some training and even some law enforcement equipment like night vision goggles. He gave them to Sheila so she could help her friend. Of course, there is no friend. The relationship she's worried about is the one between Nelson and Annalisa.
And it was at that time, really, when Sheila Davalu began stalking Nelson, using night vision goggles, following him.
Once this came into focus, the level of obsession that Sheila had with Nelson and the different means that she would pursue him, it really became apparent that she wanted to take out the competition.
When you look back at it, it's absolutely frightening.
Nelson has already been cleared of any involvement in Annalisa's murder, and it's now clear to Stamford police that Sheila had plenty of motive to kill Annalisa. But did she have the opportunity?
We know Purdue Pharma has a wonderful security system and that she worked there on that day. Was she working at this time?
What we see is Sheila Davalu taking a long lunch on the day that Annalisa Raimondo was murdered, and during the time that the 911 call's made. So here's the opportunity.
We played the call for so many of her family and associates, and there were a number of them that said, that's absolutely Sheila.
The only thing left is to tie her to the crime scene, and that's where the DNA comes in. They already have samples from Annalisa's apartment, and if Sheila is a match, that's pretty much ball game.
The lab results come back with a conclusive match for Sheila's DNA. Now, in addition to the attempted murder of her husband, she is also charged with the murder of Annalisa Raimondo. Coming up, Sheila puts her defense in the hands of the only person she trusts, herself.
She believes these grandiose thoughts of herself that I can talk my way out of this. Everybody's going to believe me.
In February of 2004, Sheila Davalu faces trial in New York for the attempted murder of her husband, Paul Christos.
Prosecutors not only have the weapon and the eyewitnesses at the hospital, they also have Paul's direct testimony.
Paul was a very good witness. He was very forthcoming. The attack at the hospital kind of locked into his mind that this was an attempt on his life.
He had these loving feelings for her, so it was very upsetting for him to know that the woman he married tried to kill him.
The jury was sympathetic towards Paul, and the evidence was very strong. Sheila was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Sheila serves nearly 10 years of her sentence before she is finally tried for the murder of Annalisa Raimondo.
there's no statute of limitations on homicide or murder. So we had all the time in the world.
Sheila's second trial begins on January 24th, 2012. Connecticut prosecutors argue that Sheila murdered Annalisa for the same reason she tried to kill her husband.
It was all about her obsession with Nelson Sessler. She wanted him more than anything, but the feeling was not mutual.
I think Sheila saw it as a relationship, whereas Nelson saw it as someone to sleep with.
The jealous rage comes into play. We spoke about the overkill on the assault, the number of stab wounds, the bludgeoning.
In addition to her husband's testimony, the state also has strong evidence to support their case.
If Sheila Davalu didn't murder Annalisa Raimondo, why is her blood in Annalisa Raimondo's condominium? And that 911 call comes back up.
Sheila definitely attempted to disguise her voice in that call. As years went on, and we had the luxury of time in this case, the technology exploded in voice recognition, and we had experts again look into it, and they say, yes, that's definitely her voice.
So, the question always asked is, why did Sheila Davalu call 911 and not just go back to work? She's an ultimate narcissist. She cannot help herself from thinking that she can put the pawns in place to get away with something.
When the time comes for Sheila's defense, she surprises everyone by deciding to represent herself.
For as smart as this woman is, and the time she had spent studying, she just kind of fell flat on her face with the cross-examination. She seemed nervous. She seemed at many times like she didn't know where to go next with the questioning. The judge was very often frustrated with the situation, overrule what she was saying.
Her only hope was to try and discredit the evidence against her. She asked the jury if they thought her voice sounded anything like the one on the 911 tape. She also called the DNA results into question.
She felt that it was a mistake, or perhaps something that, we had orchestrated.
She also tried to use the New York conviction as proof she was incapable of committing murder. If she were the one to kill Annalisa, then it stood to reason that she would have been able to finish the job with her own husband, especially since he was tied up and blindfolded.
With Annalisa, there was rage. She went to her house, got in. There was a big struggle. I think with Paul, it was like, she had these mixed feelings. She's stabbing him, but yet she was helping him. She was stabbing him, but yet she was putting him in the car and taking him to the hospital.
On February 10th, 2012, the jury announces their verdict.
Sheila was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to an additional 50 years in prison.
To hear that verdict and just a sense of relief and, really feeling good for the family that, in a bad situation, we had given them some amount of closure here. We had ascertained the truth in this investigation.
A scorned lover's need for revenge had torn apart several lives and ended the future of a promising young woman.
I have this vision in my head of either the doorbell or a knock at the door, and Annalisa looking through the peephole and seeing Sheila Davalu and kind of being quizzical, like, oh, that's odd, but recognize her and really feeling no threat.
That's the sad part, that she opened the door for someone that she thought was a friend or, someone that she knew, and let them into her home.
Sheila Davalu is really the ultimate narcissist. Still to this day, she'll tell you I had nothing to do with it. She even says, I will pray for Annalisa and her family. She's going to pray for the woman she murdered. That's a sociopath, and that's Sheila Davalu.
He was a young man from the wrong side of the tracks, working for the American dream.
He wanted to do better himself and wanted to help other people do better.
Until an act of kindness seemed to backfire, making him a deadly enemy.
There was a darkness about him, and wherever he went, it seemed that trouble followed.
I have no idea why he hated him so much.
And when the feud ends in bloodshed, investigators find not one, but two potential killers.
It was an execution.
911, state emergency.
There's blood everywhere.
Oh my God, I fell to the floor and started saying why.
It was a nightmare. I just kept waiting to wake up.
June 30th, 2011. It's a typical workday in the bustling city of Fresno, California. Until 11:30 p.m., when the sheriff's department receives a frantic call about gunshots at a house on Alta Avenue.
911, state emergency.
I was asleep and I heard something like bang, and I came out and there's holes in the wall.
Okay.
And he was in the shower.
Have you checked on him? Does he have a pulse?
No, I haven't checked. There's blood everywhere.
A deputy is immediately dispatched to the location. He finds the caller, Cynthia Sepulveda, in tears.
Cynthia identifies the man in the shower as her boyfriend, 29-year-old James Blanco. She has no idea what has happened. When he walks in, he sees the shower curtain torn down on the floor in front of the tub, and the shower is still running. Inside the tub is a naked man lying on his back, covered in blood.
The deputy feels for a pulse, but it's clear the man is already dead.
He sees what appears to be at least one gunshot wound to the head, a broken window, and bullet holes throughout the bathroom.
He immediately calls for backup, and homicide detectives are assigned to the case.
It seems Mr. Blanco had gone to the shower and was showering. Someone stood on the outside of the house and fired into the house through a window and struck Mr. Blanco and killed him.
There appears to have been no forced injury, no signs of a struggle. It appears that someone just walked up to the house and executed him. Cynthia has no idea why somebody would want to harm her boyfriend, James. He's just not the kind of person that something like this would happen to.
James Blanco was born on December 14, 1981, and grew up in Daisy Park, a neighborhood in southeast Fresno.
My father, he worked at a cemetery, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was also a pastor. He has 3 brothers and 3 sisters. James was actually the baby of the family.
He was a shy guy. You know, when he was little, he was kind of chubby. As he grew up, he felt more comfortable in his own skin. And so he was a pretty outgoing guy. He was the kind of person that would make friends easily.
James did his best to follow in his parents' footsteps and live an honest life, but it wasn't always easy.
Southeast Fresno is a part of town where it's predominantly Hispanic. There's a lot of great restaurants, a lot of good neighborhoods, but it also has a reputation for a lot of gang violence.
As a youth, he got in trouble, had some brushes with the law even.
I mean, we didn't always go the right way, but I think through whatever my mom and my dad taught us, you know, the light kicked in for me, for James.
He consciously chose to do things different. He removed himself from gang or gang activities or people associated with gangs.
After high school, James was determined to make something of himself, so he applied for an entry-level position at a local mattress company.
The only job we had available for him at that time was in our cotton-producing area. It was hot, dirty, not really a pleasant place to work, but he took that job and he excelled at that job.
He was made a lead man in that department, and then after a couple of years, he was brought up into the office to be purchasing manager.
By the time he was 24 years old, James had been promoted to plant manager.
Which is the first time anybody had come up through the ranks like that so quickly.
He was a tough cookie. He was firm. The job had to be done right. When it came down to work, there was no messing around.
I mean, he was the first one in and the last one out. I think we all saw him as a workaholic, you know.
James also gave back to his community, using his position to hire others just like him. He even helped his brother Harvey become part of the team.
James would teach me a lot along the way on how to make a mattress. I mean, when he would teach you with so much passion. Great at doing what he did. Really great.
He was just a kind fellow that always wanted to do better himself and wanted to help other people do better.
By 2011, James was successful enough to buy his first home. He'd also recently fallen in love.
He met Cynthia through his brother, Harvey. They went to the same church. She was a single mom with a 2-year-old son, and they hit it off immediately.
He was really in love. We had never seen him so happy before.
It seemed like it was getting pretty serious, and I was anticipating buying a dress for that wedding.
James appeared to be the quintessential American success story, and his future seemed limitless.
I thought that perhaps when I reached retirement age, that I would just turn the company over to him and he would be the one in charge of everything.
But that all came to an end when someone gunned James down in his own home.
You just kind of wonder, why would someone go to that extreme?
Coming up, the crime scene leaves investigators guessing.
This isn't a drive-by shooting. Someone took the screen off the window to shoot Mr. Blanco. That's someone on a mission.
Detectives in Fresno, California, are investigating the murder of 29-year-old James Blanco, who was shot in his own home.
In front of James's house, there's one window on the right side, and that's a bathroom window. And that night, my brother was taking a shower.
James was in the shower, and basically out of the blue, someone started shooting at him through the bathroom window. Sheriff's detectives were trying to figure out what went wrong here. What happened? You know, was this some kind of gang-related incident? Was it a burglary that went wrong?
Was it a random drive-by? Did someone see an individual in the neighborhood?
James's girlfriend, Cynthia Sepulveda, tells police she has no idea what happened.
She said that she and James had met just a month before they had begun dating, and it was getting pretty serious. She had just put her 2-year-old son to bed, and they had dozed off. The next thing she heard was gunshots.
It just startled her completely. When she heard the shots, she ran down to the bathroom, opened the door, saw Mr. Blanco's lifeless body, and then ran back, grabbed a phone, and called 911. She didn't have a lot of information to offer as to who may have done this.
So investigators focus on the crime scene itself, beginning with the bathroom window.
One of the window panes was broken and a screen had been removed.
You could tell by looking at the window, the glass was broken to the inside. There was a powder ring on the screen that you could tell, along with holes consistent with bullets passing through the screen.
It was obvious that the weapon was pressed close to the window and eventually the screen taken down and shots fired through the window.
Outside, in the flower bed beneath the window, police find shell casings belonging to a .40 caliber handgun,
which was further indication that the individual was standing outside with the casings ejecting out and falling in the flower bed at the front of the house.
The bullets they removed from the wall matched the .40 caliber shells. They also found another shell casing inside the tub.
It wasn't even enough to just shoot through the window. The perpetrator took the screen off the window, put his hand or her hand through the window to get an even closer shot of Mr. Blanco.
This tells police something about the shooter.
It wasn't just a murder. It was an execution.
This is not random. In Fresno, with our gangs, drive-by shootings, but there's distance involved. This was very purposeful.
The violence of the crime scene clearly showed this was an intent to kill. There was no purpose for this other than to end somebody's life.
But who would target a beloved manager at a mattress company?
Other than the shell casings, the shooter hadn't left much evidence. The police canvassed the neighborhood, hoping that someone in the neighborhood might have seen something. As it turns out, they were in luck.
They had witnesses say that there was a truck that had pulled up across the street from James's house.
It was described as a pickup truck, and it was silver or pewter in color. It was too dark to provide any kind of more specific description of who was driving it.
The truck was spotted moving fast out of the neighborhood just after the shooting. And across the street from James's house, investigators find evidence that might help identify it.
They found tire marks of the truck, but that was about all they had to go off of.
They photographed the tire marks in case they had a tire to compare it to in the future.
Meanwhile, Cynthia has been breaking the bad news to the rest of James's family.
I dropped the phone. I couldn't talk. I didn't know what to do. I was in shock.
My mom was in shock. It was a horrible night.
As each of them find out, the family started to gather at James's house. The police have the entire area locked down at that point.
Everything's all taped off already. I'm like, oh my God, I fell to the floor. It started saying why. I didn't know what was going on. I was just so broken.
The news quickly spreads to the other people in James's life, and they all have the same question.
Why would anybody want to do something like this to James? Why James?
It was the darkest day ever because I had the very unpleasant task of informing people as they came into work. It was hysterical. People were in such disbelief.
I just didn't understand. It was something that was, you just aren't prepared for.
But James's brother Harvey tells police he might know of someone who had a grudge against him.
I just didn't think it would happen. I didn't think he would do it.
Coming up, police learn the name of a possible suspect.
Mr. Blanco was someone who was universally liked, with the exception of one person.
It's been several hours since James Blanco was murdered in his bathroom, and investigators are tracking down possible leads.
There was a lot of anger over Mr. Blanco being shot because he was someone that provided jobs, good jobs, to the young people in the community.
Most of James's family shows up at his house. His brother, Harvey, tells the police that he might know who the killer is.
He basically said, hey, no one disliked James except for this one guy.
Harvey Blanco tells police he suspects 22-year-old Rafael Apolinar, a former employee at the mattress factory.
And they started asking who he is. Why would you suspect that?
Rafael Apolinar grew up in Daisy Park, just like James. But instead of turning his back on the gang lifestyle, Rafael embraced it.
I think when you're born into a neighborhood where there's a lifestyle like that going on already, it's easier to get drawn into. And he grew up into that lifestyle. That was him.
Unlike James, Rafael was a person who might have lacked a bit of direction growing up, and that carried through into adulthood.
He had a girlfriend at the time, so he was in a relationship, but he didn't work, he didn't have a job.
Rafael's fortunes seemed to change when a neighbor mentioned him to James Blanco.
A neighbor of ours recommended a kid that needs help, a kid that needed an opportunity to get a job, to help himself, to be able to have a bank account or whatever it was that he needed.
As the manager of the mattress factory, James was in the unique position to give people, such as Raphael, a chance to turn their lives around.
I believe that James Blanco took Raphael Apolinar under his wing because he saw himself in Raphael Apolinar. He thought that he could change Raphael and make him a productive member of society.
But Harvey tells police that Raphael had a hard time letting go of the gang mentality.
His old lifestyles were still the same. You can tell by the body language of people if they're still in that type of gang lifestyle, by the way they curse, the way they talk, the lingo, the speech, and it was still pretty much a part of him.
He was a good worker, but there was times when he wasn't. He was stubborn and didn't take direction well and wanted to do what he wanted to do. And when it came down to work, we meant business.
Authority he seemed to have a little problem with, and so that was kind of the problem that erupted in the different areas that he worked.
Despite his bad behavior, Harvey says James refused to give up on young Raphael.
They moved him from one department to another department, trying to find a place where he would fit, trying to find a place where he would succeed.
He worked in the area where we processed cotton. He worked in the quilting department. He worked in the shipping department. He gave Raphael more chances than I had ever seen him give another employee.
Unfortunately, nothing seemed to work.
Raphael was just a troublemaker, and no matter what opportunity you gave him, rather than taking advantage of the opportunity, he always wanted to change it.
Ultimately, he ended up in a department that was sort of the end of the line for employees that were struggling within the company.
Then, one day in April of 2011, Raphael finally crossed the line.
He got into a physical altercation with a coworker. The supervisor had let that, be known to Mr. Blanco.
It's just the guy is not serious about the job. He was not trying to succeed. And if he's not trying to succeed, then James can't help him. It was pretty much just the writing on the wall.
After trying for a year, James had no choice but to let Raphael go.
It was a rather uneventful termination. He seemed to know it was coming. James had told me that it went well.
There was no argument. There was no physical confrontation between the two. And Mr. Apolinar was, left the premises.
I didn't even know when he was getting terminated. I just knew that it had happened. And I was like, wow, well, it was bound to happen someday. I mean, he wasn't going to last. You could just look at him and say, he's not going to last here.
3 weeks later, Raphael managed to find another job.
Raphael Apolinar's main flaw is it's his social skills, his lack thereof, his lack of sophistication. So he actually found a job that was better suited for his personality.
Raphael went to work for a furniture company delivering, and was what I was told was actually making more money and had better working conditions than when he was working here.
But if Raphael wasn't angry about James firing him, then why does Harvey think he was the one who shot his brother?
According to Harvey, the kid might have found another job, but that doesn't mean he liked what happened.
Coming up, a new witness puts Raphael at the scene of the crime.
He lays out the story of what happened that night.
The brother of slain factory manager James Blanco has told police he's convinced a former employee named Raphael Apolinar is the murderer.
Blanco fired Apolinar for job performance. He had problems with the other employees. He didn't play well with others.
Harvey knew from just personal experience that Mr. Apolinar was holding a grudge.
Harvey Blanco says that a few hours before the shooting, he was outside his mother's house talking to friends when Raphael showed up in his truck.
He has a beer in his hand. He sees me, and something told me in my mind, I go, oh my God, this is going to be trouble right now.
He had been intoxicated and was really upset about having been, terminated from the job.
And he told me, "How's your punk-ass brother doing? He acts like his shit don't stink."
He just, for whatever reason, could not get over the fact that he'd been let go.
Raphael seemed to be looking for a fight, but Harvey did his best to defuse the situation.
I just felt like it was just the alcohol talking at that time. Maybe he's just a little tipsy, drunk, he just talking, just blowing steam. I don't know what was going through his head.
Instead of engaging him, Harvey decided to leave, figuring that if he just left Raphael alone, it would all blow over.
I didn't want to call my brother to even tell him, "Hey, this is what just happened. Watch your back." He don't need this type of stuff in his life, and it happened.
A few hours later, James was dead, and Raphael seems to be the only one with a motive.
Sure enough, they found that the truck that he had matched the description of the truck that had been seen outside of James's house on the night of the murder. So they kind of honed in on Raphael.
There could have been no one else. I mean, it was too obvious. I mean, it was the way it happened, with the altercation that we had, with the threat. I mean, to me, he's suspect number one already.
A few days later, investigators tracked down their suspect.
They got in touch with him. They told him they wanted to interview him. But he did acknowledge, "Yeah, I don't like the guy. He fired me, thought that he was stuck up, thought that he was, thought too much of himself."
I guess he had told him that he was asleep, he was at home the whole time, that his girlfriend could cop to that.
Unfortunately, police don't have enough evidence yet to charge Raphael with the murder, so they are forced to let him go.
Basically what the detectives had was possible motive by Mr. Apollinaire, and then a truck that matched the description of the one driven by Mr. Apollinaire. But even with that, they did not want to rush to judgment.
Several weeks go by with no further leads. James's family and friends are beginning to fear his killer will never be brought to justice.
It was very frustrating, and thinking that he may walk away from this thing and then be on the streets, that somebody else might get hurt.
Then, on August 2nd, 5 weeks after the shooting, a young man named Andrew Macias walks into the Fresno County Sheriff's Office and breaks the case wide open.
Andrew was 18 years old. He was from the same neighborhood, and he knew James very well, but that wasn't his connection to the case.
Andrew and Raphael were gang members together. They were friends.
He reported to them that Mr. Apollinaire was in fact the person that had murdered James Blanco.
He goes on to tell them that he was with Raphael on the night that James was shot, and that he had actually gone along with him.
Andrew tells investigators that on the night of the shooting, he got a call from Raphael asking if he wanted to go to a party.
He goes, "Hey, want to go hang out with some girls?" And, this kid is a little bit younger than Raphael. And he was like, "Yeah, sure."
When Raphael picks him up, he tells him, "I have something I have to do real quick."
He didn't say what it was. He didn't say where he was going, but he just drove the short distance over to James's house.
Andrew said that Raphael parked outside of the house, turned off his headlights, and at that point he pulled out a gun.
Andrew claims he stayed in the truck while Raphael walked up to the house, so he didn't see what happened next.
He heard a number of shots ring out. Mr. Apollinaire then hurried back to the truck, threatened Mr. Macias, "Don't tell anybody." Mr. Macias only knew that a shooting had happened. He didn't know that Mr. Blanco had been killed.
After it was over, Andrew says he agreed to help Raphael get rid of the evidence.
He gave the outer layer of clothing to Mr. Macias, told him to get rid of it or to wash it, something along those lines. And then he also gave him the gun and told him to get rid of the gun. Detective asked him to get it back from whomever he had given it to, but at that point the gun was gone. The gun was not recovered.
So if Andrew was willing to cover up the murder, why did he decide to come forward now?
I think Andrew was dealing with a lot of guilt. a lot of guilt. You know, not only are we a friend of the family, really close, but being around that neighborhood, you know, word gets around, someone's gonna find out.
Coming up, Raphael finally starts talking, but his version of the shooting is completely different.
I didn't want to do it, and then he was like, well, this is scaring me.
After struggling for a month to solve the murder of James Blanco, investigators now have a witness who claims he was with the shooter, Raphael Apolinar.
Andrew Maciel became afraid because he was in the vehicle with Raphael. And so he says, you know what, I'm going to go do time for something that I didn't even do. He goes to the detectives assigned to the case, and he spills whatever he knows.
Andrew's testimony gives police enough to obtain a search warrant for Raphael's truck and residence. In the meantime, they bring him in for a second interview.
I don't know what's going to tell you. The truth. You had an issue with James. You had a big grudge. You hated him. No, I didn't hate him.
Investigators confront Raphael with their new evidence, but he still doesn't crack.
So even though Andrew explains in detail what happened that night, you deny that you were involved. And that Andrew is lying to us. I guess, yeah.
Raphael stuck to his initial story. He told the police that he was with his girlfriend all night.
Passed out. And you snuggled up with your girlfriend. Yeah. And she's going to be right there by your side to verify that story. Right?
He denies having any involvement whatsoever in James's murder. So the detectives end the interview.
Fresno police hold Raphael in custody while officers are sent to locate his girlfriend.
So they go and they speak with her, and she does in fact provide an alibi for him. He was there all night.
They're pretty sure that he's the shooter, but they still don't have a very strong case against him. Their only witness is a former gang member who wouldn't necessarily come across well in court.
But just a few hours later, Raphael suddenly decides to cooperate.
Mr. Apolinar recontacted the detectives from his holding cell and says, hey, I have more information. I won't be wasting your time.
Raphael finally confesses that he did go to James's house that night, but that he wasn't the one who shot him.
Raphael claims he'd been drinking heavily that night and decided he was going to teach his former employer a lesson for firing him.
He says that he snuck out of his girlfriend's house, got a gun from someone, but he wasn't really clear what he intended on doing with the gun.
It wasn't a full fucking plan and shit. It was just like, oh, I'm just gonna shoot him real quick.
But you're saying you don't want to kill him?
No, not kill him. Like I said, I didn't like the guy, but I didn't hate him.
He finally incriminates himself and acknowledges that, yes, he did get a gun. Yes, he did go over to Mr. Blanco's house. He did go over there with the purpose to shoot him or to at least scare him.
Why would you want to do that, though?
Because he's a dick. He fucking tried to act like he was better than everybody. You mean? Because he made it, I guess. In his mind, he made it, you know.
Andrew agreed to be his wingman.
I was already taken off. I was like, I want to go fucking shoot James. And he was like, I'm down, I'm down. I was like, alright, cool. And then we went over there.
Raphael says that he parked across the street, gave Andrew the gun while he put on gloves so that he wouldn't leave fingerprints.
But Raphael noticed a strange car parked outside James's house and decided not to go through with it.
I was like, fuck, I don't know whose car that is. I don't know about this.
Raphael Apolinar, at the very last minute, had an epiphany and said, What? Am I stupid? Why am I going to do this?
However, Andrew didn't hesitate.
According to Raphael, Andrew has the gun in his hand. He came to shoot someone, and that was what he was going to do.
He was like, well, this thing scared him. He gets out, and I'm like, I'm not knowing if he's just going to shoot at the house.
Claimed that Mr. Macias is the one who actually pulled the trigger.
As soon as I heard the gunshots, he was running back already.
But what motive did Andrew Macias have to commit murder? Raphael claims it's because James never gave him a job.
Several times, Andrew Macias had asked James Blanco for a job at Pleasant Mattress. Or at least that's what he told Raphael Apolinar. And was upset that he never got a job from this plant manager who was a family friend. That was why Andrew Macias went ahead and did the shooting.
At this point, all the police have are statements from two gang members, both admitting to be at the crime scene, but they're pointing fingers at each other.
However, investigators aren't so sure about Raphael's story.
There was no history of bad blood between the two of them, and so it doesn't make any sense that Mr. Macias would actually pull the trigger here. And then you think further about that claim by Mr. Apolinar. Well, if Mr. Macias had pulled the trigger, why would he have ever come forward? Why would he have ever, in any way, given help or information to the police on this case?
It makes a lot more sense that Raphael is the person that shot James because he's the one with motive, and he's just trying to pin it on Andrew. So they charge Raphael with murder.
On August 10th, police execute their search warrant. Unfortunately, Raphael's truck doesn't provide any proof.
They had a tire impression taken at the crime scene that matched the tires on Raphael's truck, but it doesn't absolutely tie him to the crime scene.
These were just generic tires that could have belonged to anyone. There wasn't anything about them that made them unique. And they didn't find any gunshot residue or ammunition in the truck either.
But investigators do find something at Raphael's house.
Authorities found gloves in Raphael's home that had gunpowder residue on them.
It's not a smoking gun or anything, but it does connect to the evidence he gave. So the evidence is really starting to pile up.
Coming up, Raphael faces trial for murder, but a last-minute surprise might set him free.
That star witness for the prosecution never showed up.
Was he the shooter or was he not the shooter?
On April 12, 2016, 5 years after James Blanco's murder, Raphael Apolinar's trial finally begins.
There's a variety of reasons. Court cases, unfortunately, just drag out all too long. It can be difficult for victims' families in particular as they're waiting for justice.
It was not easy. It seemed like it just went on, and I felt so bad for the family.
It was real frustrating. You wanted it to end already. Yeah, you're mourning the death of your little brother. You're trying to get closure.
Prosecutor Brian Hutchins describes Raphael as an angry young man who saw James firing him as a sign of disrespect.
There's this mentality of gang members that, yeah, I'm the man, don't disrespect me. It's almost like they wear their ego on their sleeve.
And Raphael's own statement to police establishes his intent to exact revenge.
There was a confession to a desire to kill Mr. Blanco. And so you start there, the motive. You look at the violence of the crime scene, and then you look at the gunshot residue on the gloves. He went there with a gun for the purpose of shooting Mr. Blanco.
They not only have a star witness that puts Raphael at the crime scene, but also admits to helping Raphael cover it up.
All of those add together, and it's clear Mr. Apolinar was the shooter.
But when the state calls Andrew Macias to testify, he's nowhere to be found.
he had disappeared. We had him served with a subpoena. He apparently went into hiding. We could not locate him. We knew that he had concerns over his safety.
The question was, did Raphael intend on getting rid of Andrew so he wouldn't testify? Or was Andrew lying the entire time and was just trying to pin the murder on Raphael?
That created kind of a hole in the case, a vacuum of what happened, what would he have said? And so that's something the jury did not have available to them to consider. And it opened the door for speculation of maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
The defense uses the opportunity to put Raphael on the stand in his own defense. He sticks to his story, insisting Andrew was the one who shot James Blanco.
I was concerned that he may somehow convince the jury that there was enough doubt to not convict.
Raphael's testimony is basically that gang members always have each other's back, no matter what. So when Raphael decided that he couldn't shoot James, Andrew stepped up and did it for him.
But that doesn't explain why police found gun residue on Raphael's gloves.
There's a possibility that you could have a transfer of the residue, but the amount that was located was too high to make that story not very probable.
The jury deliberates for 6 hours before reaching a verdict.
It was hung 8-4. And to me, that meant that 4 people in that jury did not believe beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Raphael Apolinar who pulled the trigger.
The jury basically couldn't completely agree on whether it was Raphael or someone else like Andrew who actually committed the murder.
However, that doesn't mean Raphael is exonerated on all charges.
Mr. Apolinar admitted to going there with a gun with the plan to shoot Mr. Blanco. You can't get around that.
He doesn't understand that you don't have to pull the trigger to be convicted of first-degree murder. And he lays out every other element of the crime.
Raphael was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
When we finally got the verdict and the conviction, it was a relief. This guy's gonna go do, pay for this crime.
I think there was a sigh of relief, although I felt personally that the sentence should have been more severe. I mean, it was premeditated murder.
If the jury was able to determine with certainty that Raphael was the actual shooter, that would have been an additional 25 years.
A young man's bruised ego had robbed a community of one of its most promising leaders and torn 2 families apart.
There's not just the Blanco family grieving. The Apolinar family is grieving. There's not one, there's 2 mothers crying. And so it's just such a tragic thing that in one bad decision on one day, 2 lives and 2 families could have been completely destroyed.
And although justice has been served, James Blanco will be missed by all who loved him.
It doesn't bring James back. There's days, even now that, I'll sit in my truck and I'll talk out loud. I'll say, James, I miss you.
He loved his family. He loved his fellow workers. I loved him. I believe he loved me. As a father figure, I loved him as a son, and had great plans for him.
He was everything to me. I wrote that in a letter to Raphael. I couldn't stop you from taking his life, and I hated you. But I want to tell you, I don't want to feel like that no more towards you. I want to forgive you.